was getting ready to talk about erosion sediment control and stormwater management. I want to make two overarching points before I give a little discussion as to sort of where we are and why we're here, respond to some of the comments. But the two main points that I would like to say first, and will reiterate, is land disturbance cannot begin until project-specific erosion and sediment control and post-construction stormwater management plans have been approved by DEQ. Sure. And I think this may have come up in some of the comments yesterday about tree felling. So, activities that may result in soil erosion are considered land disturbing activities. The typical list, although it's not completely inclusive because you don't know exactly how somebody's going to do something, but traditionally we look at the removal of cut trees, grubbing, clearing, and grading. That's the general universe of activities that result in land disturbance because of the potential. So there's also a silvicultural exemption, which we don't need to get into at this moment for this conversation. So if somebody utilized an existing access road with a flatbed truck and walked in with their saw and cut down a tree and let it sit there, chances are, unless something freakish happened in terms of, soil erosion, that would not be land disturbance. So we, as a general rule, hand felling of trees, leaving them in place, is not considered land disturbance.
What about the open access?
There are nodes, and MVP's plan is to improve some of them, but to utilize an existing access road would not be land disturbance.
But to build a new one?
Yes.
And start clearing the right of way with it?
Yes. Other than hand cutting of trees.
So if they went in there with bulldozers, back in, front loaders or backwards or anything like that, to try to clear trees out of land disturbance.
And it would be in violation of the board's regulation concerning erosion and sediment control. And the other point I wanted to make is that we've actually added a condition to the 401 certification that was proposed in July that makes it clear as a condition of the proposed 401 certification that MVP must comply with all requirements of erosion and sediment control laws and regulations, and we also make it clear that those requirements are enforceable under both the 401 certification and each of those programs. And it was interesting, I think one of the commenters yesterday mentioned something about potential federal preemption, and I wasn't even thinking of that when I put this condition in to the proposed 401, but I believe it addresses that because it makes it clear that it's a requirement of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the applicant has to comply with our E&S and stormwater requirements. So, thank you. So there's a little bit of story behind erosion and sediment control. And as I mentioned before, when other larger pipelines have been constructed, E&S and stormwater was our regulatory framework. And when the programs first came over from the Department of Conservation and Recreation, one of the most confounding provisions in both E&S and stormwater was something called annual standards and specifications. And I can remember talking to the staff that came over from DCR, and I kept saying, I don't understand this annual standards and specs thing. I But there is very specific language in both erosion and sediment control regulation and in stormwater that says for a certain universe of entities that engage in land disturbing activity, they shall develop annual standards and specifications which shall be approved by the department. And then, under the existing regulations, they're pretty much self-implementing. So the idea is VDOT, for example. It's linear utility projects. It's regular. So VDOT comes in and says, here's our annual standards and specifications. We approve them. They become the template by which all of their future plans are measured. They have inspectors. They have their own certified plan reviewers. Traditionally, our involvement and oversight has been complaint-based. So if we get a complaint against a road building activity, we'll send inspectors out and work with VDOT. The other thing about the annual standards and specification program is that it takes local E&S and stormwater authority away from the jurisdiction in which the activity is happening and gives it to DEQ. So I sort of understood all these bits and pieces, but not as well as I should have, and I think it was one of the first times I was asked to come out and address pipeline issues. It was a meeting of the Roanoke Basin Bi-State Committee, and the localities there said, hey, is it true that we're not the E&S enforcing authority? So I went back, read the regs, read the statute, had a conversation with Dave Grandis, and said, yeah, of state law and regulation, that authority is taken from you and given to DEQ. And then I opined, right or wrong, that the idea was that these are multi-jurisdictional projects. So there was some decision, some conscious decision to leave those projects with one regulatory entity. So rather than working with every locality and getting E&S plans approved that we're going to apply to a multi-jurisdictional project, instead of working with each locality, you worked with DEQ. So I believe that's why that provision is in there. So we started down that path and we reached out to MVP early 2015 and said, okay, you don't have annual standards and specifications for your operations in Virginia, so we need to start working on that process. The other thing some other things I came to learn about annual standards and specs is, again, it's self-implementing. So once those annual standards and specifications are approved, those entities, those annual standards and spec holders, are not under an obligation to submit project-specific plans to DEQ. There's an assumption that they'll apply their annual standards and specs, they'll draft their plans, and DEQ's out of the picture. So actually interested citizens kind of brought that to our attention, and we heard very, very loudly, you can't let this huge construction project happen in a self-regulating environment. So we contacted MVP, I want to say it was spring of 2015, and said, look, even though you have the right to operate under annual standards and specifications, we are asking and will require of you to submit for our approval project-specific erosion and sediment control and stormwater management plans. We also have a very unusual provision under annual standards and specs that says we can actually charge annual standards and spec holders for plan review and inspection costs. So we also put MVP on notice and said, and not only that, but you are going to be responsible for DEQ's costs in reviewing your plans and our costs associated with inspecting construction once these projects are initiated. So we have gone well beyond what the regulations require in terms of requesting those project-specific plans. And we have been working almost 2 years now to approve E&S plans and stormwater plans. We also, okay, so here's the other thing that's a little bit different about E&S. We are used to our permitting world where permit actions that DEQ take, whether it's under the VIPDES regulation, whether it's under the VWP regulation, our authorizing statute has us involve the public. We put our draft permits out for public notice and comment. There is an opportunity for hearing, and if we get to that point, the board is the decision-making authority. That doesn't exist in E&S. E&S is a function of DEQ, and there is no parallel authority for the board to review E&S plans. And in fact, E&S plans have to be approved by a certified E&S plan reviewer. So there isn't that typical public notice and comment opportunity that we're all used to. You know, this is a huge project. We'd really like to be able to weigh in on those E&S plans. So in that letter we sent MVP where we said you have to do project-specific plans, you have to reimburse us for our costs related to plan review and inspection activity, and you must post your E&S and stormwater plans on a publicly available website so folks who are interested can take a look at it, and we will take technical and engineering comments if folks find something that they want to communicate to us in these plans. I think one of the things that's been a little bit confusing is that even though we approved the annual standards and specs for MVP at the very, very end of June this year, the plans that came in weren't immediately approvable. And what MVP chose to do was they sent us plans for one construction spread, and that's to serve as the template for then how they would continue to apply those practices in subsequent spreads. And what we put out for the public to view were those original plans. And there were, and no criticism intended for MVP, they weren't right. There were a lot of changes, there were a lot of details, so we have been working with them for months to get those plans to a point where they are approvable. So one of the commenters yesterday said the post-construction stormwater management calculations aren't correct. We don't disagree. The plans haven't been thoroughly revised to be consistent with the requirements, and they're not going to be approved until such time as they are consistent with your regulation. So we don't have finally approved plans for either erosion and sediment control or stormwater. And we have been working, I think my guys have been meeting at least once a week with MVP, their consultants, their E&S and stormwater guys, and we've really made huge improvements. The plans are pretty cool, but they haven't been approved yet, and construction can't occur unless and until those plans are improved. The other thing, and I really apologize for the long explanation, but the other thing is, for the vast majority of construction activities that exceed 1 acre of land disturbance, those projects have to be covered by your VIPDES stormwater related to construction activity. It's called the construction GP. That is a Section 402 of the Clean Water Act VIPDES permit. What we use in that permit is we actually, before anybody can even get coverage under that permit, they have to have approved E&S, stormwater plans, and a stormwater pollution prevention plan. So for 99.9% of the construction activity that happens in Virginia, they have to have all of this coverage, but guess what? Congress exempted construction related to natural gas transmission pipelines from requirements to obtain a Section 402 permit. So I believe it was the 2005 Energy Policy Act. There was language in that federal law that said these construction projects shall not be required to get a permit. EPA eventually updated through some federal legislative process, which I don't pretend to understand, the Water Act, and it's in our regulations. So traditionally, we would have this permit tool, which is how we would bring in E&S and stormwater and SWIPs. Congress exempted it, but we are using every single requirement that's otherwise in that construction permit we have embodied in the annual standards and specifications. And 401, we are now making it clear as a condition of the 401 certification they have to comply with E&S and stormwater. So I know that is a terrifically long-winded explanation, but it really is an interesting set of twists and turns in statutory and regulatory law. I believe that even though we're not required by law or regulation, we have gotten the same place by requiring project-specific E&S and stormwater plans for all land disturbance areas, whether it's the right-of-way, the access road, the laydown yards and equipment storage areas, and stream crossings, which I will talk about in the next subject area. So having said all that, I can certainly understand why it might be a little bit confusing as to what the role of E&S and stormwater is in this process. As I said, we put all these plans out for review. We told the public that we would let them be reviewed for at least 30 days. MVP gave us a template spread originally, then we've made a lot of changes to, and in the end, I think for some of the later spreads, there was only that 30-day period for folks to comment. But we really received a very, very limited number of technical comments on the plans. I want to say maybe about 15. So the idea that, yes, it's true, there is not by statute or regulation a public participation opportunity. We went above and beyond the requirements and we put them out there for folks, and we encourage folks to take a look at them. And one of the things we really were hoping for is that landowners could say, hey, you know, there's features on my land that aren't reflected on this plan drawing. So I do feel like we really went above and beyond, and yes, we are still reviewing those plans. I also wanted to take a minute, and this may, I'm sorry.
I just want to understand, your assurance is there can't be any land disturbing activity prior to approval of the Region 7 control plan and or standards and specs.
Yes, sir.
But we're being asked to certify prior to those standards on the, we should hope that they will be good standards and annual plans and good Region 7 control plans that will ensure that the project will not cause same level of quality standards to be violated. So I guess I've heard some say that that's a cart before the horse problem. That and the assurance you're giving us is, well, there can't be any land disturbing activity, therefore no project will be commenced. So it's not really a problem that the cart is before the horse. Is that, am I understanding? Am I characterizing?
And I'm also saying that a certified plan reviewer who works for DEQ, who has spent almost a year and a half reviewing these plans, will determine whether with your regulations. So it's twofold. It's we are looking at those plans, they have to be in compliance, and that's what I've tried to achieve with putting that specific condition in the 401, that they have to comply. I mean, they have to comply because of your regulation anyway, But now to make it a condition of the 401, we're not going to, DEQ is not going to approve those plans unless and until they comply with your regulations, and they're really, really, really technical. And I have a little bit to discuss about that if we want to go there, but I don't believe it's putting the cart before the horse. Those plans. I wanted to spend a moment, and this is where it's dangerous for me, because as you all know, I am not an engineer, but I know that there have been conversations about what kind of practices and protections do we have for construction in steep slope areas. And this is kind of a summary, which is in steep slope areas, obviously, there are going to be project-specific plans and specs for erosion and sediment control practices, and we use them in series. And it's just not a random selection of what are we going to do to control runoff. It is based on the factors in the regulation, and the steepness of the slope really indicates how many measures in sequence are going to be needed. We do know that water bars, which are diversions that take water off of the active construction area, will be closer and closer spaced in steep slope areas. And we also know that a critical component of managing stormwater in these steep slope areas is diverting clean water. So you construct diversions so that you don't have a lot of sheet flow actually crossing the disturbed area. That also lets us appropriately size E&S measures for that water that may be picking up the sedimentation from the construction site. The water bars, the slope breakers reduce velocity and kind of disaggregate the volume. And we also require the use of trench breakers in areas where there is an open trench. So those are designed to divert water from the trench so it doesn't act as a conduit to just shoot down that trench. And then a lot of times we pair trench breakers with slope drains. So again, you're getting water out of the trench and dispersed across the slope. So there's a number of engineering features that we use. I put some typical E&S measures that are often used in utility line construction, whether it's a sewer line, a water line, a pipeline, and people who are much smarter than I actually are going through page after page after page and looking at the topographies and the soils and saying these are the features that we need to have in place in order to control E&S. Then the flip side is we are evaluating what the permeability, what the runoff is from this pipeline once it's stabilized, and are going to be requiring appropriate post-construction stormwater management features. And that's consistent with any construction that occurs in Virginia after July 1st, 2014. So if you have detailed questions on E&S measures, I'm going to have to call somebody up to join me, but that's kind of the overview.
And I'm working to have questions.
Thank you.
What I wanted to know is, are there any variances being requested by the applicant?
So, there is in our E&S regulations. So, let me back up. So the regulation describes 19 measures, control measures. And then we have something called the Stormwater Handbook, which actually is really the engineering information about how you implement the 19 minimum standards. And there is a minimum standard, and I believe it's 16, but I'd have to double check. Open trenches shall not exceed 500 feet. But there is also language in the regulation that says in some instances that might not be practical, it might not be safe for the construction activity, it might not be cost effective, and we are asked to balance that 500-foot trench limit with the circumstances specific to the project. So at this moment in time, we have not approved any variances. There have been conversations. There will, in all likelihood, be a variance to that 500-foot length, but that will be in the context of approving the project-specific E&S plans. One of the things we're taking a look at is whether that variance from the 500-foot trench, certainly, you know, we think it should be a smaller variance in steep slope areas, and what we've been talking about is, and again, nothing's been approved, so I'm just kind of giving you where our thoughts are. We have thought about in areas in which there is an excess of a 30% slope, more like 2,500 feet. The 12 miles that I know folks mentioned yesterday, the 7 miles, that is nothing that we have considered. It's nothing that we're contemplating. We're really looking at a trench, an open trench variance that accommodates the kind of construction activity, which is when you build one of these things, as you can imagine, it's done in sequence, and I know that MVP is available to better explain that construction sequence if you're interested. But yes, we have been asked to grant variances, we haven't granted them, and we are not looking at a 12-mile variance. I think right now we're looking around 2,500 feet for more than 30% slope, and less than 10% slope to manage the water. But again, that will be determined as we finalize plan review and approval.
Just one more question. Do you have any idea of how much, and maybe this relates to the variance, but how much land would be cleared at any one time for construction that, you know, had yet to be restored? And how much, I guess, forest would be removed permanently, sort of the macro scale?
There are probably those figures available in the FERC documents, and I do not have them. I know that there have been some conversations between Mountain Valley and Roanoke County, and that MVP estimated that the total land disturbance for the project within the 322,000 acre Roanoke River watershed upstream of Roanoke City, the total land disturbance for the project is slightly less than 400 acres, or about 0.12% of the area of the watershed. And that's associated with the 120-foot construction right-of-way. And then, once you shrink that right-of-way for the permanent access, it goes down to about 0.05% of the watershed. And that's just a snapshot that I happen to know. I have figures, but again, if you want more details, you can ask MVP.
I'm going to try and make this not too technical.
Thank you.
We heard a lot yesterday from various soil scientists about the acid forming materials, which was a little bit of education. Is there any, based on the current review of the E&S plans and the standards and specs, is there an alignment of how to address, is there an identification of where there are acid forming soils along the pipeline route, and in the E&S plan, plans about how to address that and stabilize those? It was my understanding that soil, because it forms acid, then it's difficult to stabilize it with traditional E&S measures. And so I'm curious to know if that connection has been made in terms of the E&S plan and the ability to stabilize it, particularly in the steeper slope.
I'm going to have to call in some assistance to answer that one. And State your name and title so the court reporter catches it, please.
My name is Ben Leach. I am a team lead for the Office of Stormwater Management. I'm in charge of standards and specs and plan review for the state. In regards to that, acidic soils, they are having a mitigation plan post-construction in which they will be applying lime and other techniques to neutralize that acidic soil to allow for vegetation to occur post-construction. There is a post-construction plan for which they will follow if, for whatever reason, that soil is not neutralized and able to receive stabilization. So yes, we are identifying them within our plans whenever the bands that we know of show up within the mapping.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Ben.
So you mentioned with respect to variances, you're not entirely sure which ones might be approved yet. But of course, you'll know that by the time the final thing review is complete. When again is that supposed to happen?
Well, I am not, we and E&S and stormwater plans will be approved by early part of the new year, hopefully January.
The class mitigation plan that was referenced earlier is also just about to be complete. Do you have a date on that one yet?
I'd have to ask Will. The plan, the dye trace report? I believe Will said, so he did the work. Yes. No, it's called the karst evaluation plan, which is why it's confusing. Sure. So not to confuse everybody, but the supplemental karst evaluation plan is what been titled.
Okay, so that would be the results of a
Yes.
study, not a plan to do dye tracing. So
Correct.
The name's a little misleading. Yeah, this is, so the question was, when will the dye tracing study, which is going into the name of the supplemental karst evaluation plan, when are those results ready? The preliminary report is complete. I can provide it at any time. There is one more set of receptors that we want to analyze before we finalize the report. It's not going to have any significant bearing on the results. It's just more for completeness of the report. In a cave, and the cave is behind the spring. We haven't been in to get the dye trap out of that cave, but we're 98% certain that the trap in the cave is going to be the same water that's at the spring right outside the cave. So you could have the draft report